Our next session is going to be a presentation from Professor Lynn Vavreck. Lynn is the Marvin Hoffenberg Professor of American Politics and Public Policy at UCLA. I have to keep reminding myself UCLA is in the Big Ten now. We reluctantly allow that to happen. She's the author of 5 books, including The Message Matters, The Economy and Presidential Campaigns. She's also co-author of Identity Crisis, the 2016 presidential campaign in the battle for the meaning of America, and The Gamble, Choice, and Chance in the 2012 presidential election. At UCLA, she teaches courses on campaigns, elections, public opinion, and the 1960s. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Rochester. So welcome, Lynn Vavreck.
Thank you, and thanks everyone so much for coming out today to talk more about politics this year. My goal here in the next 20 minutes or so is to talk to you a little bit about this work that I did with 2 co-authors, Chris Tasanovich and John Sides. This is a book that we wrote on 2020, but I want to push it into how I am thinking about what happened in 2024. And so I'll talk a little bit about how I'm thinking about the 2024 election, and then we'll have more of a dialogue where we can all talk together about how you're thinking about it, and see if we can figure some things out. So I want to start talking about 2024 by taking everyone back to 2008. Okay, in 2008, in Ohio, Barack Obama was out on the campaign trail and he met a man named Joe. And you guys may all remember, Joe was a plumber. And for the better part of 3 weeks in 2008, Barack Obama and John McCain talked about Joe the plumber. And the major disagreement in 2008 in Ohio was whether Joe's taxes were going to be raised under Obama's tax plan to raise income taxes on households earning more than $250,000 a year. So a few weeks after Barack Obama met Joe the plumber, John McCain marched down the same city block in Ohio and he met Joe the plumber. And he said, "Congratulations, Joe, you're rich." Well, Joe didn't feel very rich. He was a plumber who had a small business, but under Obama's tax plan, he was considered rich. And this was the conversation that dominated things in Ohio in 2008. So now fast forward to 2024. In 2024, our politics feels more divisive. We are arguing about different kinds of things, person-based things, immigration, abortion. And of course, in Ohio in 2024, politics was more divisive and person-based, and instead of arguing about whether Joe the plumber was rich or not rich, instead we were talking about whether people who had come to a small town in Ohio were eating the pets of their neighbors. This is a very different kind of politics. It feels more divisive because it is more divisive. And so as I look back on the 2024 election and the elections prior to that, and try to take a long view of what's happening in America, in American politics right now, where I end up is with sort of a simple observation. It's not 1930 anymore, it's 2030. Right. The next president of the United States will take office in January of 2029. So we are a quarter of the way through the 21st century. And yet so many of us think about politics by saying, when is it going to go back to normal? When are we going to be talking about Joe the plumber? Okay. My argument that I want to try to convince you of today is that we're not. We are not going back. And that's not meant to be a Kamala Harris quote. But it's not the 1930s, the New Deal era, where we debate the role and size of government, the tax rate. That era is over. And we have entered a new era of American politics where we're fighting about different things, a different dimension of conflict. And Brian talked about this in the morning session as well. The new dimension of conflict are these identity-inflected policies, and they are shaping the political landscape. What's uncomfortable about this is it is more divisive because these policies are about people. In 2016, they became defined around a central question: who gets to have membership in our national community? Who gets to call themselves an American? That's naturally a very divisive conversation. They're also harder on which to compromise. So these person-based policies, for example, same-sex marriage, unlike with the tax rate, where I could want the tax rate to be 35%, you could want it to be 30%, we could compromise at 32.5%. I give a little, I got a little, you give a little, you got a little, and we both walk away feeling like, okay, that worked out okay. But on issues like same-sex marriage or a religious test to enter the country or building a wall on the border, you can't be married on Monday and Tuesday, not on Wednesday and Thursday, and on Fridays only if you want to be. It's harder to compromise on these kinds of policies. So it feels divisive, but it also feels uncomfortable because I think when you're living through major change, you don't have the perspective to see that you're part of a long-term process, and that feels uncomfortable. But what I want to encourage everyone to do is to look back with a little wider lens over the last 25 years of American politics and to appreciate that we have lived through something big and that we are squarely now landed in this new kind of conflict. And this is where it's going to be. Okay, so just to give you a bit of evidence for how this all takes shape. Now we'll go back to 2012. So this is the second Obama election, the Obama re-elect. And in 2012, we were in the field with a survey where we were re-interviewing people over and over again throughout time, a panel survey. And so in 2011, we had asked people a bunch of questions about topics that we thought might be relevant to the 2012 campaign. And then in 2012, we asked them who they voted for in the election. And I wanted to show you just 3 of those questions here. So in 2012, we asked people to rate Muslims as a group on a 0 to 100 scale, where 0 was you feel very, very cool about the group, and 100 was you're pretty hot on them. You like them a lot as a group, and 50, you had a neutral feeling. And here I'm showing you for white voters who cast ballots for Barack Obama in 2012, how many of those voters told us that they rated Muslims as a group on the unfavorable end of a favorability scale. And that number is 35%. So more than a third of white Obama voters had an unfavorable view of Muslims in 2011. Similarly, a third of white Obama voters in 2012 favored making it harder for people to immigrate to the United States. And a third of white Obama voters believed that illegal immigrants are mostly a drain on society. Okay, so these are people who are going to shift toward Donald Trump in 2016. Okay, but they're Obama voters. And the question is why? And the answer is in 2012, the 2 candidates, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, they weren't fighting over these things. This was not a dimension of conflict in the 2012 presidential election. They talked about immigration. Mitt Romney said auto deportation, like one day. That was basically the end of the conflict during the campaign. And there's no better way to make something irrelevant in a presidential campaign than to have both candidates basically have the same position on that issue. If that's the case, it doesn't advantage either one, and they don't want to fight over it. So in 2012, these attitudes are out there, but they're not structuring the conflict. In 2016, Donald Trump comes down the escalator, Trump Tower, and he declares this election is going to be fought about something very different than the last several presidential elections. We are going to be talking about keeping people out of the country. We are going to be talking about who gets to call themselves an American. And all of a sudden, these white Obama voters who were they were voting for the Democrat, all of a sudden, when these things become the dimension on which 2016 is contested, they have a choice to make. They're misaligned with the Democratic Party on these issues. In 2012, these weren't important issues, but in 2016, they are important issues. And so these voters have a choice to make. Stick with the Democratic Party and be misaligned, stick with the Democratic Party and change their views on these things to match the party, or keep their views and align with the Republican Party. 3 choices. So what I'm going to show you next is a bunch of data that suggests that many of these people did the last thing. They kept their views and switched their vote to align with Republicans. And that changes the shape of American politics going forward. It produces this new dimension of conflict, this new sorting of the electorate. And then my argument is that that's repeated in 2020 and again in 2024. So let's take a look and see what you guys think of this idea. So I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures that look like this. And what I'm showing you here is on the horizontal axis, this is going to be the Democratic Party's share of the 2-party vote. This is in 2008. So there's always going to be one election on the horizontal axis. And then I'm going to plot the next election on the vertical axis. So the Democratic share of the 2-party vote in the next election. Now I've drawn for you a 45-degree angled line there, the black line. That 45-degree line is basically telling you if a state, all of the plotting symbols are states. So every state is on this picture. If a state gets the same share of the Democratic 2-party vote in the 2008 election, say 60%, right? If it gets the same share in the next election, 2012, the dot's going to be right on the line. So if states are performing similarly in both elections, all the dots are going to be on the line. Okay, so this is 2008 to 2012. All of the dots are not on the line. What does that tell us, right? Most of the dots are below the line. So that's Barack Obama doing less well in 2012 relative to how he did in 2008. The shine came off Barack Obama a little bit everywhere between 2008 and 2012. And that's the global financial crisis giving him a boost in 2008. He's picking up a lot of votes. And then maybe we think of that 2012 election as sort of a re-equilibration back to the mean. Okay, but it's pretty much happening everywhere in every state. This is a very typical picture. We could go back and draw this for 2004 to 8, 2000 to 2004. We typically see states moving in the same direction in about the same amount. And political scientists call this uniform swing. Everybody moving a little bit in the same direction. So now I'm going to show you what happened in the next set between 2012 and 2016. So here you can see some dots are above the line. Texas, Arizona, Georgia. Some dots are below the line. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan. So here, what the picture is telling us is that in some states, Hillary Clinton picked up votes relative to Barack Obama. She did better than Obama in Texas and Georgia and Arizona. But in some states, she did worse than Obama, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan. And this up and down pattern, this is not a uniform swing. And this is my argument that this is a resorting or a shuffling of the electorate based on this new dimension of conflict in 2016, these identity-inflected policies. The New Deal is out and identity issues are in, and we've sorted. So now we're going to do the next set of elections, 2016 to 2020. And this is a real test here. So if my hunch is right, that 2016 ushered in this sort of new playing field for American politics, then we shouldn't see this kind of reverse jagged pattern. If we see this again, essentially it's going back to the old order. But if we see something that is near that 45-degree line, that's going to be every state doing about what it did in 2016, right? So what is the picture going to look like? And it looks like this. So 2016 to 2020, those dots are pretty close to being on the line. They're a little bit above the line almost everywhere. What does that mean? That means Joe Biden is picking up votes almost everywhere relative to what Hillary Clinton did in 2016. The 2020 election was a replay of the 2016 election. If we draw this with counties, 3,150 some counties in the country, from 16 to 20, almost every county is on this 45-degree line. It's about a 1.5 point swing in absolute value on average across all the counties in the country. That is what we call calcification. It's sticky, right? The state of American politics is people know the parties want to build very different worlds. They know which world they want to live in. And doesn't matter who the candidates are, doesn't matter there's a global pandemic, doesn't matter there's a huge social justice movement. People know which world they want to live in. And there's very little swing happening between 16 and 20. Okay, so this is a little uniform swing up, possibly due to COVID. You know, we could think of stories. Whatever the story is, it's affecting people across all the states in roughly the same way. Okay, so now what's the picture going to look like from 2020 to 2024? So let's take a look. So here you can see, I've added one line for you on this figure. The blue line is the line of best fit through the state dots. And it just helps us to see that everywhere there is a uniform shift away from the Democrats. So this is Kamala Harris doing less well than Joe Biden did everywhere. And again, by, on average, single digits. So this is a uniform swing down. Democrats losing votes. And we could think of lots of reasons. Inflation, Americans not feeling the recovery. Barry showed us a lot of good stuff earlier this morning. 70% of people think country's going in the wrong direction. 86% of people think inflation has negatively impacted their family in some way in the last year. These are not great numbers for an incumbent party. And so this is the shine coming off the Democrats between 2020 and 2024. But when I saw this on election night, I had one thought: what does this look like relative to 2016? So it's a little bit, in 2020, it was a little bit too early to say, we're in a new political order, right? It was one election. Okay, but now we're at 2024. And I saw this and I thought, okay, this is uniform swing. That's step number one for my theory that we're fighting over something different now and that fight changed in 2016. But then I said, what do these numbers look like relative to 2016? Because remember, in 2020, Biden picked up votes. Now Harris is losing votes. So do the math. Is 2024 a repeat of 2016? And the answer to that is pretty much. So here I'm plotting for you 2016 on the horizontal axis and 2024 on the vertical. The 2024 election is almost a replay state by state of the 2016 election. The parties want to build very different worlds. Voters know it, and they know which world they prefer. And we're not fighting about the New Deal anymore. We're fighting about these identity-based issues. Brian just talked about those in his presentation as well. And I want to just pause to say that I'm talking about issues and policies. I'm not talking about identity politics. I'm not talking about the group that you're in, your identity. Okay, that's different. I'm talking about things that we're going to have to write down rules about. Who gets to use which bathroom in the foyer of this building? Who's going to play on which sports teams on these great athletic facilities that you guys have here at the University of Wisconsin? Somebody is going to have to write down a rule, a policy, a law. That's what we're talking about. The contestation of politics, not how you identify as a person and, oh, my group has been with the Democrats or my group's never going to. That's not what we're talking about, right? This is the actual legislation that we're fighting over. Okay, so I want to show you one last set of evidence to try to convince you of this, and then we'll do a little Q&A. So I want to move now to individual level measures of vote choice. And this is kind of the same idea, but instead of doing it for states, I'm doing it for people. And we have been asking the same people, thousands of them since 2011, to tell us about what they think about America and who they're voting for in presidential elections. And so at the top, I'm showing you individual level transitions across the candidates from 2012 to 2016. And the way you're going to read this table is you're going to read across the rows. So you're going to say, conditional on being a Barack Obama voter in 2012, what did those people do in 2016? Did they choose Clinton or did they choose Trump? So conditional on being an Obama voter, 81% of them voted for Clinton, 9% for Trump. Conditional on being a Romney voter, 5 of them for Clinton, 84% for Trump. So in this 12 to 16 transition, this one that I'm telling you reshaped the landscape of American politics, only 81 and 84% of people are sticking with their choice in the prior election, right? 5% and 9% are peeling off to vote for the other party. That's a lot of transitioning. Compare it to the 2016 to 2020 transitions. And again, these are the same people who were interviewed at this moment in time. This is not like recall. Tell me, do you remember who you voted for in 2016? Right? This is in 2016, they told us. And then in 2020, they tell us. So conditional on having voted for Clinton in 2016, 95% stick with Biden, only 2% peel off. And then the same for Trump. Conditional on voting for Trump in 16, 94% stick with him, only 2% peel off. Okay, so that's much less transition, right? So we've shuffled and sorted between 12 and 16, and then now we're in this stickier period. So this is the same pattern that I showed you at the state level, but now it's for individual voters. I can do this with panel data from 20 to 2024, and the numbers look a lot like this lower panel. But instead, I'm going to show you the exit poll data from 2024. Same idea. So now this is recall, but I wanted the data to be fresh from election night. So here, people are remembering how they voted in 2020, but conditional on having voted for Biden in 2020, 93% stick with Harris. Conditional on having voted for Trump in 2020, 95% are voting for Trump. So sticky, but a little more slippage on the Democratic row than on the Republican row, which is consistent with how the 2024 election played out, state by state, county by county, and at the individual level. Okay, so to wrap up, the politics of the 21st century, which is now a quarter of the way over, right, starts in 2015 in the 2016 election, when Donald Trump comes down the escalator and declares that we're not fighting about New Deal issues, the role and size of government, the tax rate anymore, and that a new dimension of conflict is going to be elevated. I'm not suggesting that Donald Trump created these attitudes. They pre-exist his arrival on the scene. Mitt Romney knew about them. John McCain knew about them. Previous Republicans and Democrats knew that these attitudes existed. Right? But both Brian and Barry talked about this. People have attitudes about a lot of things. Part of what's going on in election contests is the candidates try to focus our attention on the dimension that benefits them, on issues on which public opinion is lopsided in their favor, and their opponent is stuck in the unpopular position. That's a huge part of what election contests are about. What is the conversation going to be? And the conversation in American elections changed in 2016, and it is my argument that it is not going back. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on this and answer some questions.
And if you want to join me at the table, Lynn, we'll have a conversation.
Great. Yes.
You can sit.
That sounds great.
So if you're in the room, do hold up your cards and we'll collect those and work them into the conversation. If you're online on Zoom, use that Q&A function and we'll address as many questions as possible. All right, so Lynn, this is really fascinating. I sense a little bit of a tension in what's happening. On the one hand, we've been through this destabilizing period where identities have been reshuffled. Seems like it coincides with a period of immigration, large immigration wave, relatively speaking, and attention to that, growing diversity of the electorate. So maybe all that's destabilizing, and we've had periods like that in American history, waves of immigration, diversification that have destabilized things. And yet we've kind of settled in to this new pattern, but it's happened all while Donald Trump has been a candidate 3 cycles in a row. That doesn't happen very often in American politics. I think of William Jennings Bryan or someone like that, Franklin Roosevelt, who were on the ballot several times. So do we know how much of this is people just settling in around Trump and he kind of defining the coalitions, and how much of it is the roiling of demography and identity that maybe will keep going once he's gone from the scene?
I think the way to think about that is, I'll sort of simplify the question. Tell me if this is a good simplification.
Please.
Like, how much is Donald Trump implicated in this? Is that
yes.
sort of fair? One way to think about this is that there's nothing magical about 2016. Didn't have to happen then, but it did. And why did it happen then? So all of these attitudes, as I said, pre-exist 2016. The demographic changes that you're talking about, they don't happen overnight. They're happening slowly over the last decade and a half. And we know that Americans have been sorting and shuffling themselves to make the parties more homogenous, make each party more homogenous in terms of issue positions over the last 2 decades. So a lot of this is slow. In the bitter end in the book, we call those things tectonic changes. That's moving very slowly over the last 2 decades. These things have been happening. Okay, so that's happening out there. But there's nothing about 2016, about any of this that says, and all of that, the earthquake from the slow tectonic moves was going to happen in 2016, right? What happens is, I don't know, you can unravel this as far back as you want to unravel it. If Barack Obama had not made that one joke at the Correspondent's dinner in 2000 and whatever year that was, making fun of Donald Trump, maybe Trump wouldn't have wanted to run for president. He thought about running in 2012. He decided not to. In 2015, he decides he's going to run. But maybe he wouldn't have decided, and he would have sat that election out. If Trump sits 2016 out, 16 people ran for that nomination. I don't know. Who would have won the nomination? You guys tell me. Maybe Jeb Bush, maybe Marco Rubio, maybe it would have been Ted Cruz. Who knows? Maybe it would have been John Kasich. But none of those people would have run the campaign that Donald Trump ran. I am 99.9% sure of that. Why do I think that? Because they are all politicians, and they are a lot like Mitt Romney, and they are a lot like John McCain. Now, Romney and McCain, who also knew what the landscape was, who knew there were advantages to priming patriotism, because patriotism is highly correlated with attitudes about race and others. Everybody knew this. But McCain and Romney, they don't go there, and they are on the record talking about this. They're running against the first black man to be president of the United States. And they are both on the record as saying they did not want to win by, quote unquote, playing the race card, even if they did that through the angle of patriotism. Trump isn't concerned about that. He is not constrained the way maybe a typical politician would be, doesn't really care how he wins. McCain and Romney cared how they won. Trump doesn't. But Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, John Kasich, even Ted Cruz, I would argue, are much more like Romney and McCain than they are like Trump. So let's just play it out. One of those people wins the nomination, 2016. What would have happened? My guess is Hillary Clinton would have won that election. She probably would have been reelected in 2020, even with COVID. And then we'd show up in 2024 in a completely different place than we are right now. So part of this is long-term change leading up to this moment, but a very big part of it is what political elites, and I mean in this case presidential candidates, and I mean in this case Donald Trump, right? What they do with the playing field that they arrive on. So he is culpable in this. It wasn't inevitable, but he didn't invent it out of whole cloth. The foundation was there.
All right, you've touched a chord. I've never gotten this many index cards at any event I've been at.
Oh man!
Settle in, people. We're going to be terrible.
I'll try to give short answers. Those of you who know me know how challenging that's going to be for me. So I'm going to try.
All right, we're not going to get to all of these, but hopefully we can talk during breaks and lunch as well.
Okay.
So a couple questions about gender as an identity. So in two of these last three elections, one of the candidates has been a woman. You wouldn't see that identity show up in the state shifts that you showed, the scatter plots at the state level, because the mix of men and women is about the same in each state. What role do you think sexism, gender identity, masculinity, all of those things play? Is that part of the identity story you want to tell? How does it fit?
So again, the identity argument that I'm making is not about your personal identity, but is about policies. And so in this case, abortion as a person-based policy that affects women, sure, this is important. And I think I'll say two things quickly about this. These elections, 16, 20, even 2024, there's a great piece in the Times today debunking the myth that this was a landslide. These last three elections are very, very close. We saw on your slide 1960, 1968, 1976, 2016, 2020, 20. These are the closest elections in our nation's history. So what that means is that almost anything can be pivotal. Right? When the election is that close, when people who know who they're voting for, the 95% of people voting for the same party, when that's soaking up most of the electorate, the people left, the persuadables, the swing voters, whatever you want to call them, they're pivotal. And so, yes, can issues related to gender be, swinging that group? Yes, absolutely. What I will tell you about 2024 is we were in the field with a huge survey. We interviewed 250,000 people in December of 2023, and then 6,000 people a week, every week, going through 2024. We have a measurement on this survey that measures people's sexism attitudes. And if you are somebody who does not think highly of women, does not think women should be in the workplace, they cause more trouble than they're worth, all these kinds of things, people actually answer yes to these things. If you're someone at that end of the scale, you were not likely to vote for Joe Biden in January, February, March, April, unlikely to vote for Biden. Biden's not a woman, right? Why? Because those kinds of sexist attitudes are correlated with a bunch of other things that have already led you away from the Democratic Party. Harris gets the nomination. Those people with those sexist attitudes, still unlikely to vote for the Democrat. Okay, so the relationship between those attitudes and Harris is not unique. It was there when Biden was the nominee as well.
All right, we've got maybe 3 versions of this question about the role of the media in all of this as the catalyst to make this happen.
Okay.
And they all have something to say about kind of the pulling apart of the media from the days of there being 3 mainstream networks and common newspapers we all read.
And that's the way it is, Barry.
Yes, it's fractured, right? We have, cable, social media, podcasts now, all the rest of it. Is that a catalyst to make some of this stuff happening you're talking about? Is it reinforcing it, or do you think it's sort of a sideshow?
One thing we know from decades and decades of social science research across all disciplines, persuasion is hard. Okay, so it's very hard to change someone's mind. So let's keep that in mind. The second thing we know is the media environment has changed a lot. It has, I'll say fractured. That makes it sound bad. It is diversified in the way you've described. And then I would say the negative implication from the diversification is the blurring of the lines for people across what is reporting and what is not. So when I can start a podcast and talk like a political reporter, it's very easy for someone out in the world to tune into my podcast and think that I have engaged in political reporting, and I have not. I can just sound like a reporter. That blurring of the lines, I think, is very bad. But persuasion is hard. So it is hard to change people's minds. What it is not hard to do is change the kinds of things that they think are important problems in the country. And so if with the diversification of media, people are more able to tune into the kinds of things they're interested in and the points of view that they have, then I think what is of concern is not changing their minds. They already think these things, but changing the way they see the problems facing the country. Immigration, crime, Muslim ban. I should be thinking about these things and not the tax rate and Social Security and whether that should be privatized. And so I think that does add to candidates' abilities to reshape the set of problems that we're thinking about. But I don't think it's a problem of sort of telling people what to think.
Yeah. I was amazed at the Republican convention in Milwaukee. One of the arenas was nothing but streamers and broadcasters.
Yes. On
the right side of the spectrum, since they were attached to the Republican Party. I didn't appreciate till they were all in one place how large that ecosystem was, and I saw, prominent Republicans essentially parading around to do interviews at each stop along the way. So it's definitely part of what's
I just
happening.
want to throw out too that I can't even remember. Maybe it was the 1990s. I don't know, a long time ago. I think it was Ken Auletta wrote a book called 3 Blind Mice. And the 3 blind mice were ABC, NBC, and CBS. And the argument was that they're all in cahoots, pack journalism, they follow one another, we're not getting the truth. And we need more people out there putting the spotlight on politicians to hold them accountable. Well, welcome to that world, right? There's some sense in which, why is this bad? It's more sunlight on the people we want to hold accountable, who we want to represent us. This should be good. And I'll recommend to you all a very nice series that was on HBO Max called The Girls on the Bus, which is a play on Timothy Krause's book, The Boys on the Bus, about political reporting. It's based on a book written by a New York Times reporter, but it's a super charming eight-episode series, and it will really give you some insight into these streamers and how hard it is for them to be taken seriously, and what they have to do to stay in business is very different than what legacy media reporters and editors and publishers have to do to stay in business. It'll give you some insight into this world.
All right, one more question before lunch.
Okay, all right.
This person says, I know I'm going to hear at Thanksgiving, this is the most polarized election, or this is the most polarized we've ever been. Your evidence sort of suggests that at least people have settled into their partisan preferences. Would you just, and you say it has implications for policy views. Would you agree with that? Maybe not ever, but at least in modern times, we're at a kind of height in terms of party loyalty and the polarization of the parties.
Well, not in terms of party loyalty, right? People have always been loyal to their political parties, but people today the American National Election Study has been going since the 1940s, and it asks people, do you see important differences between the two political parties? And in the 1940s, 50% of people said, I see important differences between the two political parties. Okay, everybody in this room understands why that is. In the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, for a large part of the country, there wasn't any difference between the two political parties. I'm thinking about the South. So this was what's happening in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We get into the 70s, and the Democratic Party in the South changes. All of a sudden, the South has two-party competition. So that's the 70s and the 80s. More people are saying, oh, I see important differences between the parties. Okay, that's going to get us to 1990. From 1990 to the 2020s, right, we go from 60% of people saying they see important differences between the political parties to today, that number's over 90%. So the last time the National Election Study asked this, that's everybody. 9 out of 10 people in the population saying, I see important differences between the two political parties. So do they want to build different worlds? Yes. Are those worlds farther apart than they have been in our lifetimes? Yes. Do people know that? Yes. If that's your definition of polarization, then yes. But I will also just say that in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, people lamented the fact that we didn't have two unique parties to choose from. The parties aren't different enough. They're echoes of each other. There's no clear choice. Right? This was what people were upset about. Again, careful what you wish for. We now have two political parties who really are unique. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like we have choices. And so the problem, I think, is that these elections are turning on so few votes, and that is making them feel capricious. So one year the Dems are winning, one year the reps are winning, they're flipping back and forth. So few votes are swinging these elections. These are not mandates for one of these worlds or the other. But when one party wins and then the other, that switch, the worlds they want to build are so different that it feels like massive whiplash for voters when it happens. Even though, this election, 115,000 votes in 3 states would have swung this election the other way. That is so few people. So it's complicated. Polarized, I guess, but, really what people are grappling with is how we could have this set of policies in one 4-year period and then swing way in the other direction in the next. Right. It's very few people making that transition.
It's all heightened by the knife-edge nature of the political competition.
Exactly.
All right, we have to end the formal panel here, so let's thank Lynn Vavreck.
Thank you, guys.